Okay, ladies and gentlemen, happy Monday. Hopefully, you guys had a good weekend in regards to getting some work done. And while I'm at Founders Hollow today and tomorrow, I figured it would be best to continue on with the notes. So, hopefully, everyone did well on their quiz. As a reminder, if you haven't submitted your homework via e-backpack by now, please do so. Please do not wait to the end of the period to submit that. I will be looking for that. But nonetheless, on Friday, we left off talking about the importance of mercantilism, an economic principle utilized by most European countries of the time that looked at the colonies as a way to make money. And specifically for England, obviously, their colonies are going to make them a tremendous amount of money, both because of the raw materials that they had and offered that were certainly making a tremendous amount of profit over in Europe, but also, as we said, the colonies provided another marketplace for England to sell their goods. Now, in order to ensure that they controlled all trade, and in order to ensure that the colonies exported more than they imported, and starting in 1651, Parliament and English monarchs began to pass a series of laws that became known as the Navigation Acts. And as we said on Friday, talking about each of the three listed here, that all products needed to go to England first, that they needed to be on British-owned ships, and colonial crops went only to England. And we said on Friday, in each of these cases, it really came down to the why, as you see here. It's to make money, all right? But specifically for England, all products going to England first, that meant that England was able to tax all goods that went into the colonies. So, for example, the British East India Company, we said, the British East India Company that grew tea in India, before they shipped directly to the colonies, they would need to go to England so that they could sell their tea. And the reason they went to England is so that the government could tax those products. Imports came on British-owned ships to ensure that competition wasn't entering into any of the marketplaces or major port cities. And colonial crops sold only to England, and that way England could set the market value, the market price of these goods that are being sold here. Now, the way it was spun to most colonists here, certainly a positive effect, was that it created a sure market. Colonists were guaranteed that they were going to be able to sell their goods. However, over time, the colonists begin to realize that they could probably make more money if they were able to decide who they sold it to. Why is England deciding as to who and when and where they could sell their colonial crops to? And that obviously becomes a negative effect. Many colonists came to resent the Navigation Acts. They felt it was an abuse of power by England and English Parliament. And moreover, it led to smuggling. All right, illegally importing or exporting goods, all right, trying to basically break the law. So what happened in the colonies, if British tea is being sold for $5, people would try to circumvent that, go around the system by trying to smuggle in Dutch tea and selling it for cheaper. And obviously England wants to try to take hold of that. So overall, mercantilism is effective for the parent country, but it's also effective in galvanizing the colonists, getting them to resent English law. And as we'll see in chapters 4 and 5, it is certainly going to set the stage for what is to become the American Revolution. All right, guys. So section 2, I apologize on my app here. We, for whatever reason, the font didn't transition over. All right, but section 2 here is going to talk a little bit about colonial life. Now, when we talk about colonial life, I think it's important to understand that what we're going to be speaking about in this section is more or less what a majority of the colonists' life was like. Obviously, this is not speaking to everyone's life, so to speak, but today we're going to take a look at the roles of really men, women, and children in colonial society, as they each played a significant role in developing the culture here, which in some ways was similar to England, but in many ways very much different. So let's take a look at what the average colonial family was like. Now, when we talk about colonial families, I think it's important to talk about that a majority of them, as we've already spoken about, would have lived on farms. The reason as to why living on farms was an attractive thing for many colonists was the fact that if you owned land, you had the opportunity to vote, you had the opportunity to participate in government, but it also meant in Europe, land was a measure of a person's wealth. And for many of these colonial families, though, it wasn't as if they were living in these large plantations, these large mansions. For the most part, they were property owners. A majority of families fell into what we would consider to be the middle class. As you're going to read tonight in section 2, there were social classes in the colonies, and a vast majority of colonists were in the middle class. They had small homes. So when we talk about small homes, we're talking about an average of about 2 to 3 rooms in a home. Okay, so not too big, however, not necessarily too small. But we're also talking about colonial families that lived in 2 to 3 bedroom homes with their extended families. Now, I would venture to say that most of you today live with what we would consider to be your nuclear family. Your nuclear family consists of mom, dad, brothers, and sisters. Your extended family consists of mom, dad, brothers, sisters, grandma, grandpa, cousins, and uncles. So when you take that into perspective, we're talking about colonial families living in 2 to 3 bedroom homes. Some of them you had more than 7 or 8 people in. So as far as living comfortably, so to speak, I don't necessarily know if that would be the case for a vast majority of colonists during that time period. Now, although I'm not there, I'm going to do a little exercise, so to speak. By a show of hands, how many of you sleep in a twin-size bed? Okay. How many of you sleep in a full or queen-size bed? How many of you sleep in a king-size bed? And usually, I'm guessing 2 or 3 hands, maybe 4. Some of you are probably lying. Have a big-size bed all to yourself, all right, which is amazing. During colonial times, especially children, they would be sharing their beds with their brothers and sisters, just based off of the availability of rooms. Now, many of you probably have therapeutic mattresses and nice soft pillow tops with therapeutic pillows. Remember, mattresses, there wasn't any sleepies or places where you can get comfortable furniture, so to speak. So these mattresses and beds were made, by the families. Made of hay, made of something that I'm sure none of you would find to be too comfortable today. Now, the question as to why were families living with their extended families is quite easy. If you weren't living on a plantation and you didn't necessarily had slaves, if you owned a farm, you needed workers. And it made sense for families that shared property to work on the farms together. So that's why when we're talking about majority of colonists here, it's father and sons as well as nephews and cousins working on the farm, or uncles and grandpa as well. And when we think about the colonial life as a whole, I think it's also important to understand that many colonial homes were far apart, which made them self-sufficient. To be self-sufficient means that you're able to do things on your own. So for the colonial life, colonial families averaged anywhere between 5 and 6 kids here in the colonies. That was the average. And I also have some other interesting information about colonial life. The way I introduced the section before was saying that while many people, colonial life was similar to that of England, it became also at the same time very different. And I came across this short article that I'll share with you guys now, which has some interesting, to me, fun facts about what life was like in the colonies, and particularly with families. And it says this: by the mid-1700s, it became clear across the American colonies that settlers had become increasingly less English. Travelers described Americans as coarse-looking country folk. Most colonials wore their hair long. Women and girls kept their hair covered with hats, hoods, and handkerchiefs, while the men and boys tied their hair into ponytails until wigs came in vogue in port cities. Now, the reason as to why women typically wore handkerchiefs or hats or some sort of cover over their head was because of the availability of fresh water. Today, we talk about good hygiene and showering or bathing every day. That was not the case during colonial times. You might shower once or twice a week. So that's why, to keep your hair clean, especially working on farms, you would wear handkerchiefs. It went on to say this: colonials made their own clothes from linen and wool. Every home had a spinning wheel and a loom, and the women of the home sewed and knitted constantly, since cotton cloth would not be readily available until the 1800s. Plentiful dyes in the colonies, like indigo, birch bark, and pokeberries, made for colorful shirts, pants, dresses, socks, and caps that were all made at home. Okay, so when we talk about self-sufficient, a lot of people couldn't necessarily afford to go into these port cities to buy these manufactured goods that were coming in from the colonies. Here's some an interesting note about the diet. It says this: Americans grew their own food and ate a great deal of corn, roasted, boiled, and cooked into cornmeal, bread, and pancakes. Hearty vegetables like squash, beans, joined apples, jams, and syrups at the dinner table. Men and boys would frequently hunt and fish. The animals of choice, rabbit, squirrel, bear, and deer, used from venison, became common entrees. Pig raising became important, but beef cows, as well as milk, were scarce until the 18th century, which is the 1700s and beyond. Given the poor quality of water, many colonials drank cider, beer, and corn whiskey. And yes, that includes children as well, drinking corn whiskey and beer at dinner. As cities sprang up, the lack of convenient watering holes led owners to water their cattle with the runoff of breweries, yielding a disgusting variant of milk known as swill milk, which propagated childhood illness. So when we saw the domestication of cattle in the 1700s, instead of giving them clean drinking water, they were giving them the runoff from breweries. So if cows are drinking beer, it led to swell milk, and that caused a tremendous amount of disease. So obviously not too smart there. Even without swill milk, the article goes on to say, infant mortality rate was high, and any sickness, usually in the colonies, meant suffering and often death for children, especially infants. The article goes on to say that doctors were few and far between. The American colonies had no medical schools here in North America until the eve of the American Revolution, and veterinarians usually doubled as a town doctor or vice versa. Going to a physician was usually the absolute last result, since without any anesthesia, any serious procedure would involve excruciating pain with an extensive recovery. Women especially suffered during childbirth, and infants often had such a high mortality rate that babies in the colonies were usually not named until the age of 2. And that's an amazing colonial fact, that children weren't named until the age of 2 because of the high chance that those children would not only survive childbirth, but the early infant stages. Instead, what mothers and fathers would do was refer to their children as the little visitor or even it. So imagine calling your little brother or little sister it, if you don't do that already. But that became common practice in the colonies. Despite the reality of this difficult life, it is worth noting that by 1774, American colonists had attained a higher standard of living that far surpassed that found in most civilized parts of the modern world. So as much as how poorly this sounds in some of the conditions, it's actually better than a vast majority of the world. So I just find, and the article goes on to say a few other things that I'll talk about when I get back to class on Wednesday. So I think an important perspective to keep. Now, I also have here a little bit as far as town life is concerned. It wasn't as popular because if you lived in a town, that means you didn't own land. And if you didn't own land, that meant you probably didn't make a lot of money. If you didn't have a special skill set. When we talk about town life, it's typically those artisans who would have been carpenters or masons or coopers or blacksmiths or silversmiths. Those people made money. Voting wasn't necessarily a big deal for them because their skill set would have been able to help them provide for their families. A lot of those people who were not married, who were single, wound up living in towns or cities, but nonetheless not as popular as owning land, but still about 20% of colonists would have lived in towns or small cities instead of owning property. Now, what when we talk about colonial life and the colonial family, I think it's important to understand that men, women, and children, as I said earlier, each had a particular role. And during colonial times, the men in families typically had to be what we would call a jack of all trades. It's a fancy way of saying that they had to do a lot of different things in order to make sure that this family was going to be well off and survive. So, what do we mean by that? Well, as I mentioned before, the men in the family hunted. They were the main providers as far as food. They were the ones that took care of the farm. They were the ones that were out fishing. They were the ones that would have to help and keep up with the domestication of animals. So there were a lot of things that the men were responsible for as far as the day-to-day activities. From sunrise to sunset, those men living on farms, particularly husbands and fathers, it was an all-day affair. 7 days a week. And certainly manual labor was something that would have taken up a vast majority of their day. As far as families are concerned, this was a similar culture to Europe in that it was a male-dominated society. So what I have here controlled all income and property. That meant that if all income that was made by the family, it would be the male, the husband, the father, who would make a decision as to what they would spend their money on. If a woman made clothing and she was able to sell it in a market or in a small town or city, any money that she made, she would then give to her husband, and all major financial decisions were to be made by the husband there. I have here people were to respect their decisions, and it's more or less just an emphasis that's placed on the notion that again, re-emphasizing the idea that it was a male-dominated society. The decisions that were made as far as where families lived, where they sold their goods, how they lived their life, when it was time to sell their farm and either upgrade and looking to own more land or move to another colony. It wasn't necessarily a conversation point amongst the family. It really was just something that the husbands, the men, were expected to do, and really the family had to respect those decisions from there. Obviously, when we talk about the ability to vote, we are exclusively talking about white male landowners. Okay, there were some free African Americans that would have been living here in the colonies. While they did own land, they could not vote. All right, but as far as a vast majority of the white male landowners, yes, they were allowed to vote, and that was a convincing thing in regards to reasons as to why to settle here. As for the women in colonial society, I think it becomes an important point. I noticed that my bullet points aren't coming up on this version of the explain everything feature here. So there's your 3 bullet points. I think for the role of women, it's important to understand that they did, in some ways, not have much of a voice during colonial times, especially when it came to their own marriage. Marriages during colonial times were typically based off of a parent's decision. All right, so the old nice love stories that you see on TV and the movies of boy and girl fall in love and they live happily ever after. That typically didn't happen during colonial times. The parents would make the decisions for their daughters, and there were really 2 big factors. Everyone likes to think that the major factor was money, and yes, it did play a factor. All right, parents typically would want their daughters to make sure that they were taken care of, so they would want their daughters to marry someone who owned land. But religion definitely played a major factor in a parent's decision, especially when you think about the New England colonies and the Puritans. All right, Puritans were expected to go on to marry Puritans. So, yes, land, financial status was a big thing, but also just as important during that time was religion. As far as a women's daily life, daily routine was concerned, I have here childcare was probably the most important thing, raising the children. If an average colonial family has 5 to 6 kids, taking care of kids from infancy to early teenage years is a big deal. Okay, and then from there, cooking, gardening, making clothes. You see over here, this is what a spinning wheel would look like. All right, so typically families that lived on small farms, they couldn't afford to go out and buy new clothes for 6 kids, mom, dad, and even extended families. So a lot of clothes were made via this spinning wheel. All right, which was the taking cotton fibers or wool and stringing them together and then knitting. Okay, so knitting shirts and pants and caps and sweaters, etc. There. Okay, some families, especially in the back country, would expect mothers, women, to help out in the barn with animals. Okay, as far as that is concerned, but when we think about women's role in society, colonial society back then, the one big thing for them is that they would not be able to be elected to office, and nor would they be ever able to vote, which is obviously a big concern amongst many during this particular time period. Now, did women question this? I always get this question in class. Were women okay with this? And the answer was, it's a complicated one, because it's not as though that they were okay with it, but they were accepting of it. This was a product here in the colonies of what culture was like in Europe during this time period. Women went on to accept the fact that school was not necessarily a huge deal. Getting a job was not necessarily a big deal. It became culturally acceptable for women to not participate in government, to not vote, and really to be the glue that kept the family together in many ways. When you look at, what they were expected to do here specifically, this is why families were the way that they were, and it was under the tutelage and leadership and the commitment that women had, and specifically mothers had, to their family, which is obviously a good thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop here for today. I think it's a good point. Figuring the lesson, what you guys should have, it was about a little less than 10 minutes remaining. So the idea would be now for you guys to start your homework. Homework is to read section 2 as well as your key terms. In addition, if you haven't submitted your homework on eBackpack assignment 3.1b, I would ask that you do that now. So the plan tomorrow will be to wrap up with section 2. It will be another Explain Everything lesson. When I return from retreat on Wednesday, I'll open up class with opportunities for you guys to ask questions in regards to anything that I have just discussed for today's lesson. Alrighty, so make sure you are on your best behavior. Say thank you to your sub on the way out, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me in the time being. Alright, take care, guys, and thanks for listening.